Hello everyone and welcome to today's Geobites presentation, How Smart is the Smart City? My name's Helen and I'm one of the outreach team at the university, and today I'm joined by Dr Daniel Boss and one of our current students, Noah. Daniel, Noah, do you want to say hello to everybody?
Hi everyone.
Hello and welcome to this afternoon's.
So they'll be able to talk to you shortly. We've got a recorded session by Dr Fiona Williams, who will introduce herself in a second on the screen. You'll see her shortly, and then Daniel and Noah will talk you through our live Q&A session. So if you do have any questions, feel free to ask those in the chat function, and we'll get to those as we go along. My colleague Chantal will be moderating the questions as well. Do you want to say hello, Chantal?
Hi everyone.
There we go. So there's a few of us here looking after you this afternoon. So I'll hand over to the presentation from Fiona in just a second, but just a reminder to you that if you do want to ask those questions at any point, you can ask those and they'll just pop it up in the chat function and we'll see those on the right hand of the screen. Your audio and video won't be shared this afternoon, so you don't need to worry. And you can ask questions anonymously as well if you wish. There is a tick button there for you. If you want to do that, you can like other questions that other people have asked as well if that's something that you're interested in, and that'll let us know which questions are the most popular and which ones to ask first and in what order. And without further ado, I think we're ready to start, so I will hand over to Fiona on this presentation.
Hello and welcome to this afternoon's Geobites session. I'm Fiona Williams. I'm a senior lecturer in human geography in the Department of Geography and International Development, and I'm programme leader for the BA Single Honours Geography programme. I'd like to spend the next few minutes talking about the smart city, what we mean by the smart city, why there is a need for the smart city, ask questions such as what does the smart city look like, and ultimately question how smart is the smart city. So the why of the smart city? Well, the population of urban areas is increasing and increasing at quite a rate. A world population of around 7.8 billion, around 56% of those people live in urban areas, and that number is projected to increase to 68% by 2050, according to the United Nations. So what does that mean and what problems does that present? Well, cities allow much in the way of new opportunities in terms of jobs, wealth generation, innovation. Together, cities already consume 80% of global material and energy supplies and produce 75% of carbon emissions. Also, developing world cities are growing so fast that they're struggling to meet their infrastructure needs. And concentrations of population in a single place also make cities vulnerable to disasters and climate change. So these challenges presented by urban living require new approaches towards trying to find solutions for those challenges. As we've seen, we're in this state of increased energy consumption and demand, and also within the context of globalization. Another key trend that we've seen is this huge advancement in technology. And the governance or the developers of the city are looking to find ways of making their urban area more competitive, more attractive to people and investment. And increasingly, there are pressures for economic development to be part of the green economy, or for what we term green economic development, in order to try and mitigate climate change, increase disaster and climate change resilience, and make cities more livable and socially inclusive. And a big part of this drive is what we term smart technology. And this all fits under the broad umbrella term of sustainable urbanism. So development within the city context that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. I'm sure that's a term that you've heard many times before. But there have been several different approaches towards trying to achieve this broad aim, these broad principles. And those approaches, in principle, tend to look at the three pillars of sustainable development in terms of the economy, the society, and the environment, and see it as an integrated whole. And some of these approaches to achieving sustainable urbanism are listed there on the left. But one we've heard more and more in recent decades is that of the smart city. A Google search, looking at policy documents, looking at the academic literature, as you can see there on the graph on the right, the top right, the smart city, the dark red line, is the term that's been used increasingly, and it's sort of more and more in recent years. And it's the smart city that tends to be the label of the time, the label of now. So what do we mean by the smart city? The label's used enormously, but what does it actually mean in practice? Well, the smart city emphasizes the role of information technologies in solving urban problems. So the technology becomes the primary driver for change. And the smart city addresses sustainable urbanism by generating innovation through information and communication technologies, thereby reducing energy consumption, reducing carbon emissions, and increasing the quality of life for its citizens. However, the smart city is also being criticised in that this approach is deemed as a sort of one-size-fits-all solution that's quite technocratic, in that there's too much emphasis on the technology in providing those solutions, and that not enough emphasis is given to the citizen, to the people who work and live in the city. And when we talk about technology, invariably we're referring to what we term the Internet of Things. And the Internet of Things is when you take all of the physical objects in the world and you connect them to the Internet. Once they're connected to the Internet, this means that that particular thing can then send or receive information, data, or both. And this ability, this Internet of Things, and the data, the big data that generates, whether it's providing, sending, receiving, is the ability to make something smart. So the application of this in practice is about making the city more efficient, more energy efficient, and more resource efficient, keeping people moving if they want to be, to get from A to B, irrigated, automated watering systems, emergency response information, for example, improving operational intelligence on a real-time, here and now basis. So, for example, if there is an incident, it allows for improved incident response. And in having that improved response and coordinating the various support services that might need to be in that particular place, it's about trying to ensure minimal damage, minimal casualties. And again, it's the information that's available in that real-time basis that enables that to happen. And the World Economic Forum have been doing an awful lot in terms of smart cities and smart city development. And they've come up with these top 10 urban innovations. Now, all of these innovations depend in some way on technology. Some can't happen without it, some are supported by it. So hence these innovations can also be termed smart. And it's worth taking a look at each of them, but we're talking about mobility, co-generating, co-heating, co-cooling. So again, we're talking about energy systems, about the greatest utilization of space, mobility on demand, for example. But the principles that underlie these innovations, it's about unleashing spare capacity, so again, being resource efficient. It's about cutting out the peak demands in terms of energy, water, etc. And also, it's not always about the sort of large-scale infrastructure. Sometimes it needs to be infrastructure that is fit for purpose at the local level. And again, it's about having people at the center of these innovations. You can have all of these wonderful innovations in practice and all of this technology that will do any number of things and generate all this information. But unless people are going to act on that and behave accordingly in the way that the inventors of this innovation or these innovations want them to, then it's a bit of a non-starter. So, technology, innovation, smart. What does that mean in terms of what a smart city might look like? Now, there are 4 cities there that can all be labelled to be smart. But in practice, you know, they're all quite different. We've got Barcelona in Spain, Tokyo in Japan, and Singapore. And Singapore is quite often held up there as the smart city. The eagle-eyed amongst you may also have noticed that we've got a fictional city in there, because in many ways that looks as though it could be a typical smart city. But of course, for those of you who know Maze Runner and the sort of the film adaptation, it's a very dark dystopian view of what a city might be. So that raises the question in a sense is, well, how do you evidence a smart city? How do you know if a smart city might present itself or might call itself as such? But in practice, it's quite difficult to pin down. The smart city is about sensors, data hubs, lots of information. But all of these things are largely invisible. But in practice, they all have fundamental implications for how the city operates and also for the lives and the experiences of its residents. So when asking the question about what is the smart city and how smart is the smart city, there's a need really to try to reveal how this technology, how this digitalization actually influences the functions of urban life. And if we're talking about urban life, it's very much about how is smart being designed to shape the lives of urban residents. And of course, in amongst that also, cities are different, people who live in the cities are different, and the cultures and contexts of those cities are very different. So it's worth trying to remember that when we're asking about how smart is the smart city. In many ways, it depends on the challenges that urban area and those cities face. Now, as I mentioned before, Singapore is quite often held up to be the global smart city. And why is that? Well, if you look at Singapore's approach to urban development, clearly, you know, it's a sort of city nation state, so it's wholly urban. So resources and the sustainable use of those resources is a big issue. But the strategies that Singapore has tended to adopt have, or at least promoted, to serve citizens and businesses. So although technology is very, very clearly there, it's about engaging people, the citizens of Singapore, in those developments, in those smart developments. And the three reasons that we're given there is about healthier citizens mean healthier cities. So again, the healthcare ecosystem, but also there's very much a community focus in terms of the infrastructure. So trying to build in walkways, green space, in terms of that smart city development. A house with heart is a home. Well, effectively what they're referring to there is the access to free public housing. And again, the way that those housing residential areas are developed, it's about community areas, it's about livability, it's about sustainability, and again, it's about economic growth. And in terms of the transport infrastructure, it's about making mobility a shared community experience. So ensuring that that infrastructure is joined up, is convenient, it's cost effective, it's accessible to all. So it allows daily commutes not to just happen on one particular mode of transport, but on a number, and ensuring that everybody can get to where they need to in the most efficient, effective and comfortable way possible. And if you look at the Singapore government agency website in terms of the Smart Nation, again, it's very clear in that you can see the emphasis on the population, on the citizens. Even the sort of homepage there, it's about a smart nation together, and this is a series featuring tech-related talks and workshops for young parents, children, working adults and seniors. So it's trying to take everybody with them in terms of this smart development journey. And Songdo is another interesting case study in that this is a city that was built from scratch on reclaimed coastal land. It's in South Korea, about 65 kilometers from Seoul, and it was an idea that let's design a fully integrated smart city and build it from scratch. So it became a testing ground for a number of cutting-edge technological infrastructure projects. So, for example, central waste disposal system, near universal sort of leadership in environmental and energy development, green building certification, incorporating 40% green space and streamlined e-governance structures. And on the face of it, again, this looks quite impressive and sort of quite forward thinking. But the difficulty that Songdo has faced is that they can't or haven't been able to get the numbers of people to move, live, work in Songdo as they'd hoped. So there have been quite a few headlines around that actually this is a very smart city, but it's all well and good having a smart city, but isn't the smart city again about people? And the point there in terms of the hardest thing about living in an eco-friendly master planned utopia is that you can't necessarily meet your neighbours, they're not there. So that's another interesting case. And then we have Barcelona. Now Barcelona's a little bit different in that it reinvented itself. It aimed through smart developments, a smart strategy to transform its economy and social profile. And Barcelona was very good early on at establishing this smart city brand. To make it work, again, it needed that leadership, that sort of quite visionary leadership and the will to make it happen. But again, technology was key to many of these initiatives and projects. And in the Barcelona strategy, whilst it was recognised that technology is an essential tool, it also needs to meet particular criteria, in that it needs to be inclusive. It needs to enable Barcelona to be self-sufficient, innovative, community orientated, and so on. And I mentioned a number of the projects, and Barcelona's investment in the Internet of Things was in terms of a number of initiatives relating to street lighting, waste disposal, the city bike scheme, which again has become very popular in other cities across the world, bus transit systems, noise sensors, irrigation, automated irrigation, and again the focus on the communities or communities in particular districts of Barcelona, this idea of a Fab Lab. So again, trying to take the residents of the city with them. And we take a field visit to Barcelona, whereby we explore some of the sort of urban development projects. And in doing that, whilst again this looks fantastic on paper, it is very clear that there are a number of problems on the ground and in practice. So it's always worth remembering when you're looking at smart cities, you need to perhaps get underneath some of what you're being told. So question what you're being told, and actually, is it as good as they say it is? So to go back to the original question, how smart is the smart city? How do you therefore identify the smartest city or a smart city? And the Urban Hub sought to do this through a big congress a few years ago now, and they came to the conclusion that actually cities that are well run and whose citizens are properly valued are those cities that are working to improve themselves in a smart way. So what does that mean then? It means that actually just having the technology and using that technology isn't enough. It needs to be configured and translated to fit with the specific contextual conditions, the particular challenges, the particular cultures, the particular situations of each city in turn. It isn't a one size fits all. And given that cities are invariably at different stages of development, depending on where you are in the world or even in a country, it's about retrofitting quite often particular activities and applying them to what's already there. And the outcome of that is that there will be hugely different approaches in terms of smart developments and service provision, and that in turn is going to produce highly variegated urban landscapes. So to conclude, the smart label is ambiguous, i.e. it can mean different things to different people, but it recognises the role for technology in solving urban problems. It doesn't involve the complete reinvention of cities, and as such it's doing different work in different places, which means that we've got a number of different urban realities. And more recently there have been calls for smart cities that are citizen focused, in that to be smart the city has to be relevant to residents. And in order to achieve that, there needs to be shared objectives so that a fragmented city can be sort of developed into a coherent whole. The other thing that's worth perhaps mentioning is that cities aren't on a smartphone in isolation in space. They have connections with their hinterlands, they have connections with each other. So that's always worth remembering as well in terms of smart city developments. What does that mean for the broader global context? So thank you very much. Please feel free to get in touch if there's anything you're unsure of. And I will now leave you in the very capable hands of my colleagues. Thank you.
Okay, excellent. I hope you all enjoyed that. I'm sure we've got lots of questions. I'm going to hand over now to Daniel.
Thanks, Helen. Hi, everyone. Unfortunately, Fiona Williams couldn't be here today, so you've got me. My name's Daniel Boss. I'm a senior lecturer in the geography department at Chester, and I co-teach a module with Fiona, which is called Smart Places, where we tackle some of these questions around smart cities. As Helen introduced at the start, there is scope for asking questions. Please do ask as many questions as possible. Before we go into answering some of the questions you've already been sending through, I want to introduce a student who's currently on the course Smart Places, who has been tackling some of these questions around smart cities and how smart is a city. So I think it'll be an opportunity to see what some of the students that we're teaching are doing around these questions. So I'm going to introduce Noah, who is a third-year student. He takes the course Smart Places. And recently we've been looking at smart cities, and he's created an infographic as part of one of the assessments, in particular looking at Singapore. So I'm going to ask Noah if he could just talk through a bit about the module, why he chose it as a geographer, and just to go over his really interesting infographic, which draws on some of the points that Fiona made. As suggested before, please do add further questions to myself and Noah as we go through. Helen, is it possible to share the infographic?
Absolutely, I'll do that now. Noah, if you want to introduce yourself whilst I get that sorted.
Yeah, sure. Hi everyone. I'm Noah, and like Dan said, I'm a third-year student studying geography at the University of Chester. Grateful to be here and to kind of give you an insight as to this really interesting module that's offered here at Chester. You may have learned from Fiona's lecture, many cities or places, not just in this country, are having to deal with various socioeconomic and environmental challenges. So, for instance, urban population growth, rural urban migration, depletion of world resources, maybe energy supplies, and of course, the ever increasing risk of climate change. So this is really why I wanted to kind of take on the Smart Places module in my third year, because we all know that technology is becoming an integral part of our everyday lives, whether we interact with it through as employees at work, as customers, as consumers, or regular citizens in society. Therefore, that's why I'm really interested in studying different perceptions of what smart is. And I'm really interested in studying how homes, towns, villages and cities kind of harness these new technologies to tackle and address these issues that we face today. So to give you a sense of the type of work you will engage with if you ever decide to come to Chester and actually take on Smart Places, the most recent assignment that we were tasked with as third-year students was to we had the aim of critiquing our understandings of what the term smart means and therefore creating our own infographic and case study of how a certain type of smart technology has been implemented into that certain place. And in another sense, we were asked to kind of contest interpretations of smart and the measures that we use to indicate whether a place is smart or not. So as you can see there on the screen now, that is my infographic that I made a couple months ago. And I was particularly interested with the implementation of smart mobility technologies or smart transport into Singapore's transport, which was mentioned by Fiona in the pre-record. And I find it really interesting. Transport because, and particularly with Singapore, because one, there are various problems that Singapore has, which requires the implementation of such technologies. So, for instance, urbanization of the world's population is a significant issue. 66% of people will reside in city areas by 2050. This is a particular problem in Singapore because it's a very small country. It's got a population of 5.6 million, and they're completely urbanized. So over 12% of land is reserved for transport infrastructure. So therefore, you need to implement some sort of technologies to kind of make an interconnected transport system. Like we just said, Singapore in 2014 organised an initiative called Smart Singapore, which includes various initiatives that are used to help this issue. And I'll move on to one of them that's explained in the mid part of this infographic is the need for autonomous vehicles, and these are driverless vehicles. And Singapore is a pioneer for this sort of technology. It ranks #1 in the world for autonomous vehicles, and making considerable progress in that sector. It's also recognised Singapore to have integrated autonomous vehicle transport into its public transport. Due to this, it is expected that driverless buses will be introduced in 2022, which will help services become more affordable for people in remote communities, which will therefore reduce labour costs and create more efficient transport in a densely populated country. This also helps the ageing population that's persistent within Singapore as well. So, moreover, as highlighted in at the bottom of the infographic, there's a bar chart that demonstrates how 7.54 million people used public transportation in Singapore. Those figures were from 2018, but you kind of get the sense that as these figures seem to rise, people need to use fewer private vehicles so that they make a more interconnected transport system and can help people move around more easily. And the Singapore government thinks that is the most pivotal part of to achieve that goal. But while this infographic, while it demonstrates all the different technologies Singapore have been implementing, you've got to remember that you've got to contest this smart technology and the fact that, is it really successful for Singapore? So, for example, autonomous vehicles are are electric vehicles, and therefore you're helping the environment because electric vehicles produce less CO2 than regular cars. However, in Singapore, 95% of its electricity is made through natural gas. Now, whilst that isn't as carbon intensive as CO2, you can then argue that you're harming the environment in the production of autonomous vehicles than actually using them. So more autonomous vehicles and the more bigger production of them, does that actually create an underlying issue of the smart initiative in Singapore? Moving on, the Land Transport Agency in Singapore has introduced something called what's called the Junction Electronic Eyes project, which involves the implementation of 400 high-tech surveillance cameras around Singapore's traffic junctions. These are cameras that monitor traffic conditions to check and verify various road disturbances. So the Land Transport Agency can make quick and effective actions to manage the incidents. So and also the electronic road pricing system is also something. If you don't get an idea of what that is, certain toll roads in this country, you'll be asked to stop and pay for using certain roads. The same idea is implemented here in Singapore, although they use global navigation satellite system technology to autonomously charge drivers in Singapore on roads in an attempt to reduce peak traffic volumes at optimal levels. This is also to reduce traffic congestion, but also the amount of people using private vehicles in hopes that people will be put off and actually use more autonomous vehicle transport or various other forms of electronic vehicles. However, these technologies are in their infancy. There are limited results to indicate if these initiatives will work over time. So, for instance, past research on the current traffic congestion pricing system in Singapore has revealed that congestion on roads has decreased and it actually has worked. However, when you charge people to use roads, they'll just move on to another road and cause higher traffic congestion on another road in another part of Singapore. So again, you look at that underlying issue of whether those smart initiatives do actually work within Singapore. Moving on again, the bus system in Singapore has to be looked at, because despite Singapore's public transport services gaining recognition for its convenience, efficiency, trains and buses have lacked certain maintenance in recent years, causing frequent disruptions affecting the interconnectedness and efficiency of the transport system. So Singapore has a scope for improving its mass transport system service, thus following the Smart Nation Singapore initiative in 2014, as mentioned, Singapore has begun implementing various Internet of Things and big data technologies. Now, these technologies are embedded in different types of public transport, such as buses, and the Internet of Things is an inherent part of vehicle management and control in Singapore, monitoring of buses. However, this is proven vital for moving 4,700 Singapore buses along every day, monitoring behavioural patterns of commuters to help future scheduling and efficiency of its transport. Although there is another debate to this technology. Now, this is because IoT, Internet of Things transport initiatives have some cyber security issues which have emerged in recent years through threats of hacking driverless vehicles or smart traffic systems linked with the initiatives. And therefore, this raises the question of whether Singapore can be a smart city without citizens actually trusting its smart initiatives. There's also, coming back to electronic road pricing, do people like being monitored and being fined everywhere they go just for the sake that they're being told to not leave their normal cars and result in using more public transport instead? People may not agree to those sort of things. So to conclude this infographic, it's apparent that the transportation systems are considerably complicated, particularly in Singapore. A growing population in a relatively small country has forced the Singapore government to evolve its transportation system to become smarter and accommodate more of individuals' travel needs efficiently. However, these initiatives, like I've demonstrated, seem to be smart, there are prevalent underlying issues such as autonomous vehicles harming the environment and ERP systems creating more traffic congestion on different parts of the city and making car ownership less attractive. Moreover, you've got the cybersecurity risks of the Internet of Things in public transport, endangering the trust of individuals with certain smart technologies. So overall, despite the smart transportation initiatives in Singapore, we do also need to consider that sustainability term, and whether or not being smart, you can be a smart city, but are you sustainable at the same time? And that's what I've hoped this infographic kind of envisions. So yeah, that's my part. Thank you for listening on that. I'm welcome to take any questions if you have any.
Thank you very much, Noah, for that. I think, again, I hope it's helpful to see in terms of the types of topics and areas we cover on the course of Smart Places, and thinking critically, as Noah has demonstrated, what smart actually means in practice. So obviously I can see there's lots of questions coming in. Chantel, do you want to feed through questions?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, so we've got 6, I think. So the first one, most of them actually seem based on what Fiona was saying, and Noah as well, seem to be based around the human experience in smart cities. The first one is there a conflict between smart and sustainable, given that smart tech is reliant on finite materials which are already under considerable pressure?
Well, that's a really good question, and it's something that Noah was actually touching upon at the end there around sustainability and smart, so it links it quite nicely. I mean, the simple answer, yes, there is a bit of a conflict there. I think what's interesting, as in Fiona's presentation suggested, how smart is understood in lots of different ways. One of the things that has been interesting from the UN, United Nations, for example, is how they are thinking about cities becoming climate smart, how they are shaping the defences and making cities more resilient through increasing infrastructure and spending on flood defences, but also thinking about how using natural infrastructures as well. It's not just a case of smart technologies, but being smart in the use of natural infrastructure. I can think about this as coral reefs protecting cities that are on the shore as well. Another interesting point that is raised in that question, that idea about finite materials and how much materials and resource intensive smart cities can be. This is often, really overlooked here, and especially if we're thinking what Fiona talked about, the Internet of Things. We can think about the Internet itself is not aspatial. It requires lots of resources, it requires lots of water to cool down the hubs. It requires cables, etc. And even things such as cloud computing, which relies upon the Internet of Things, which has been really pushed for in smart cities. Again, it's really a resource intensive. It requires a lot of resources, so there's a big tension there, and often that's very invisible in terms of when we're thinking about smart cities and this idea that smart is helps us be more sustainable.
That's great, thank you. The next one is returning to the idea of sort of human labour and skill. And it says, if infrastructures get smarter, does this not risk the loss of important forms of human expertise if there is no longer seen to be a need for it, and does that matter? Which obviously quite a big question.
Yeah, very big question. I get a really interesting question. I think, yes, there's a number of things maybe to unpack there. So on the one hand, we can see the use of artificial intelligence, how that's having an impact in terms of labour and work. On the one hand, it can help reduce the need for humans to do repetitive, mundane tasks, for example. But then there's the bigger question of what happens to work and labour with increasing uses of artificial intelligence and smart forms of labour within the city itself. I think one point to consider, we're not perhaps at that stage yet where humans are out of that process. I think we're quite far from that utopianistic or maybe dystopic understanding, this idea that automation will make the smart city run, for example. Humans are still creating these technologies. I think it's important to note, you know, they're fallible as well. One of the things we've been talking about in our class recently was about the use of facial recognition technology in public spaces, how that's been used to catch criminals and things. And again, we talked about the biases that are involved in the collection of this data and how it often targets and picks out vulnerable or minority populations within cities themselves. So the human element really is still there. And you know, it's an important aspect of how these technologies are engaged with and would be engaged with in the smart city context.
That's a really good segue into the next question, which is, what are the biggest security risks of smart cities?
Oh, again, another excellent question. Lots. This is becoming more and more prominent, and I think there's been more recent examples. I mean, we could take the bigger security issues here and more direct security issues. More recently, I think there was a city in Florida where its water treatment was attacked by a hacker, and they increased these levels of, I think, sodium hydroxide in the water treatment plant by hacking into the system. So there's a real, you know, vulnerabilities around this to cyber attacks. And the problem is as well, you don't actually know who's doing the cyber attack as well. It can be someone at the other side of the world, for all we know, doing this. So it does have a sense of vulnerability and weakness of the smart city in that regards. I think security as well, we might also think about it as an individual level, questions of privacy. Going back to the example about facial recognition technology, how that's been used in public spaces, what does that have in terms of your rights, your digital rights, and, you know, the security concerns and issues around there. There's lots of issues as we, you know, roll out in terms of these different factors in smart places, smart cities even. You can think about lots of different places, the infrastructure, healthcare as well. We've seen cyber attacks on the NHS in 2017 as well. So again, there's vulnerabilities there, and this is going to be a growing question and concern for many governments and nations.
Thank you. One for, well, probably both of you to input on, I imagine, but Noah, there's been a lot of appreciation for your infographic in the questions, and the person who posted about that would also like to know, what do you think Chester could learn from places like Singapore to help address its green mobility challenges, or do you have any thoughts on that, either of you?
I think there's a lot of scope. I think if Chester were to do something like that, I think more recently, if you go around Chester, you'll notice electronic scooters, which look very fun to ride, little things like that. Obviously, when it comes to smart technologies, and if you're more focused on, depends what you're focused on, you're focused on getting around simpler, are you do you think there should be more of like maybe carpool, car share, instead of using normal vehicles producing greenhouse gases? But it's there's a lot of things they can do, and obviously that's up to the council to decide, and I'm not too sure what the council have put in place, but I would say there's it's a very good city, Chester, because there's it's very limited in terms of where you can travel anywhere around with your cars. So I feel like you can do some things, but I feel like there's not much you can do as of now, unless I don't know something that the council is doing already.
Thanks, Noah. So we've got two more. The next one is, how far is the smart concept only applicable to cities?
Yeah, that's another great question. if Fiona was here, she would be more than happy to talk about questions of the rural, because that's certainly her background in terms of thinking about how smart technologies are applied in rural settings. And yes, it's increasingly in rural settings in certainly the agricultural industry I'm thinking of here. Smart tools, resources are being used in that context. We have things like smart tractors, and we have things such as vertical farming as well. So that's also being used in cities, but again, it's utilizing space in a smart manner, so to speak, to increase productivity around that. So concepts of making things smart are also being applied in other contexts other than the smart city. And I think the last point that Fiona made, which was really interesting, is thinking about the connections between the rural and the urban. They're not just distinct, they're intimately connected as well. And so thinking about how that smart is translated or connects and relates to that, I think are really interesting questions.
Great, thank you. And our final one is obviously the example, or the majority of examples of smart cities tend to be outside of the UK, and we've been looking at examples from the Far East. Is the UK anywhere close to this level of smart city at the moment?
Again, great question. Yeah. I'm going to take in the context of one of the tricks we do with the students when we are not under COVID restrictions, going to Manchester, because Manchester is a good example in the ways in which they've been pushing for smart technologies and to push it as a smart city. It depends on the different context, obviously. Just thinking, for example, China, the facial recognition side of things is really prominent there, and here it's not so much. But in terms of going back to Manchester, yes, there's lots of initiatives going there around transport, around mobility. We can also think about waste disposal, the introduction to smart bins, which again are being used throughout a variety of different cities and contexts, even in Chester. So it's working on it. It's behind, I would suggest, the UK in terms of the cities, but there are areas where things such as mobility, infrastructure for waste disposal are becoming prominent within cities. Noah, I don't know if you, sorry to put you on the spot, but had any comments in terms of what we were thinking about smart places?
Because I like you said, Manchester. We had a lecture a couple of weeks ago about a former student actually taught a bit about his experiences of working with a company that's interested in actually implementing autonomous vehicles into Manchester, and he asked for our advice as to how well do you think it would go with particular people, and who would use it and why wouldn't they use it. So the Manchester are definitely wanting, probably more than any other city apart from London, but actually really envision this smart city status. I would say as well that London is right up there in terms of how smart it is compared to other smart cities that Fiona mentioned in her pre-record, so Barcelona and Singapore. London have already began trying to use GPS technologies in terms of electronic road pricing. They haven't got to the stage that Singapore has yet, but I know they're investigating it and working on something like that. They also have got an autonomous vehicle, but more in public transport in terms of trams, pods. I know pods are going to be used very soon to get people around. So I think they're very close, but you've got to take into account the underlying issues, whether they are truly smart and whether they benefit everyone, not just because they're smart, but do they benefit the environment? Do they benefit people's socioeconomic status from getting from A to B, whether they live in rural to urban areas? You got to take all of these things into account, but I think they're making progress. I just don't think they're there yet.
That's great, thank you. So I think that's all of our questions. So some really interesting questions and some very thorough and useful answers. So thank you, Daniel and Noah. I'll hand back to Helen.
think you're just on mute, Helen, sorry.
Thank you. Knew I was going to do that. I just was saying that it was a great afternoon, and I've learned lots and lots this afternoon. So much more than I learned a long time ago when I studied geography. So thank you very much for talking to us this afternoon, everyone. I would just like to remind everybody that this is one of several of the Geobites sessions, and there are more to come. You can find more information about that on our website, on our outreach pages. We'll pop the link into the chat in a second, and you can also find more information about the geography department from our University of Chester website as well, and we'll pop the link for that in there too. I wish you well this afternoon. Thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you again at the next one soon.